Between the years 1827 and 1989, in a forgotten stretch of rural America tucked between the coal hills of West Virginia and the drowned towns beneath Kentucky's reservoirs, there existed a pattern of disappearances, madness, and unexplained deaths that never appeared in newspapers long enough to be remembered, yet lingered. Like a rot in the foundations of families who lived there, and the story begins in 1827 with a man named Elias Rowe, a surveyor sent by the federal government to map a remote valley that locals claimed was unsettled by the living. And when Elias arrived, he found not wilderness, but abandoned cabins, fields overtaken by blackened crops, and a chapel standing alone with its doors sealed by iron chains, inside of which were dozens of wooden pews carved with the same symbol, an eye split vertically by a jagged line, and on the altar lay a book written in no known language, its pages smelling of ash and blood. And though Elias documented none of this in his official report, his personal journal described hearing voices at night whispering his name, watching shadows move without bodies, and dreaming of a vast underground chamber where figures stood faceless around. A pit that breathed. And weeks later Elias vanished without trace, leaving behind only his journal, which was later sold to a traveling bookseller and eventually lost in a warehouse fire in 1854. But the valley did not remain silent, for in 1859, a wagon train traveling westward through the same region lost 12 people overnight without signs of struggle, their clothes folded neatly beside extinguished campfires, and survivors claimed they heard hymns sung in reverse from the forest, followed by the sound of a bell tolling, though no church stood for miles. And in the aftermath, the local preacher, Reverend Thomas Hargreave, attempted to investigate, only to emerge from the woods 3 days later, with his eyes gouged out and his mouth sewn shut with twine, yet still alive, unable to speak but able to scream endlessly until his death 2 days later, and the townsfolk buried him beneath the chapel that Elias once described, sealing it permanently, but even sealed, the ground beneath it remained, warm year-round, steaming in winter as though something beneath the earth was breathing. And decades later, in 1893, a railroad company began constructing tracks through the valley, uncovering skeletal remains arranged in circular formations around pits filled with blackened stones etched with the same eye symbol, and workers reported tools disappearing, tunnels collapsing with no seismic cause, and men walking into the forest during their shifts and never returning. And one foreman, Arthur Lowell, wrote to his wife describing how the earth whispered instructions, telling him where to dig, where to sleep, and when to close his eyes forever. And on November 17, 1893, Arthur obeyed those whispers and buried himself alive beneath the unfinished tracks, leaving behind a letter stating, "It is kinder than what waits below," and construction was abandoned, leaving rusted rails and half-dug tunnels to decay into the land. But the story did not end, for in 1918, during the height of the influenza pandemic, a nearby town converted an old boarding house into a makeshift hospital, and patients placed in the lower floors recovered inexplicably fast, while those placed in the upper floors deteriorated rapidly, suffering hallucinations, violent seizures, and speaking in languages none of the doctors recognized. And nurses reported seeing a tall figure standing at the end of hallways, with no face and too many arms, always pointing downward. And when a fire broke out in the building, killing 23 patients, investigators found no accelerant, no electrical failure, and no natural cause, only burned symbols carved into the floorboards matching those found in the chapel decades earlier, and the hospital was demolished, but the land beneath it remained barren, refusing vegetation for over 60 years. And then in 1934, during the Great Depression, a government relief camp was built nearby, housing displaced families, and within months, children began disappearing from their tents at night, leaving behind only footprints leading toward the forest that ended abruptly, and parents claimed their children spoke of the ones below who promised warmth, food, and a place where no one ever cried. And when authorities searched the area, they found a system of tunnels previously unknown, carved deep into the bedrock, filled with bones, ritual markings, and stone altars stained with substances that were later confirmed to be human blood. And one child was found alive in the tunnels, though he no longer spoke, no longer reacted to pain, and when he was examined, doctors discovered his heartbeat at half the normal human rate, and his blood type was unclassifiable, and he died exactly 13 days later at 3:13 a.m., after sitting upright in his hospital bed and whispering, "They're waking up," and the tunnels were sealed, but the earth above them continued to subside, forming sinkholes that swallowed barns, vehicles, and occasionally people, yet no bodies were ever recovered. And then came 1957, when a series of radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming across 3 states, transmitting static overlaid with faint chanting, bell tolls, and distorted voices speaking of the covenant below and the dead of flesh, and engineers traced the signal to a defunct military communications station built during World War II near the same valley, and when a team entered the facility, they found every piece of equipment powered on despite no external electricity source, and in the central chamber, a large metal door had been welded shut from the inside, bearing hundreds of handprints, burned into its surface, and when the door was cut open, the chamber inside was empty except for a single chair facing a hole drilled directly into the bedrock, from which warm air rose continuously, carrying a scent of decay and ozone, and the team sealed the chamber permanently. But the broadcasts continued intermittently for decades always, late at night, always speaking of preparation and harvest. And by 1973, the valley was largely abandoned, with only a few families remaining, among them the Grayson family, who had lived on the land for 6 generations, and whose matriarch, Eleanor Grayson, claimed her ancestors had once been guardians of something beneath the soil, tasked not with worship but with containment. And she spoke of an ancient settlement that predated European arrival, a civilization that believed the earth was not solid, but hollowed by something older than humanity, something that fed not on flesh alone, but on fear, memory, and grief. And according to Eleanor, when settlers arrived, they unknowingly built their homes, churches, and towns atop seals that had been placed to imprison this presence. And each death, each war, each tragedy weakened those seals, feeding the thing below until it could reach upward. And in 1982, when a mining company reopened operations in the area, drilling deeper than ever before, Eleanor warned them that they were cutting into the lung of something that breathes, but her warnings were dismissed, and within weeks, miners reported hearing knocking from within solid rock, voices calling their names from beneath the drills, and seeing tunnels appear where none had been dug. And on August 9, 1982, the entire mining crew of 14 men vanished during a single overnight shift, leaving behind helmets, boots, and vehicles, but no bodies, and the mine collapsed days later, sealing whatever lay beneath it. Yet reports of lights moving underground, earthquakes without fault lines, and livestock found drained of blood continued, and in 1989, a final investigation was launched by a joint task force of federal agencies who documented the entire history of the region, uncovering suppressed reports, destroyed records, and testimonies from survivors who described the same symbols, the same whispers, the same faceless figures, and the same pit beneath the earth that breathed and pulsed like a living organ. And when the task force entered the sealed chapel site one last time, using advanced drilling equipment to penetrate beneath the foundations, they discovered a massive cavern extending for miles, lined with stone pillars covered in the eye symbol. And at the center of the cavern was a pit so deep their instruments could not measure it, emitting heat, sound, and a low-frequency vibration that caused nausea, hallucinations, and uncontrollable fear. And several team members began to scream, weep, or laugh hysterically, claiming they could see their dead relatives standing around the pit, beckoning them forward, and before the team could retreat, a structural collapse sealed the cavern, killing or trapping everyone inside, and the official report listed the incident as a geological failure, though all related documents were immediately classified. And in the years that followed, the valley was designated a restricted area, removed from maps, and marked as environmentally hazardous. Yet those who travel nearby still report radio interference, sudden feelings of dread, dreams of underground chambers, and hearing bells ring. Where no churches stand, and the few remaining families claim that the earth still breathes, that the seals are failing, and that what was once contained is no longer asleep, only waiting, feeding on centuries of death, fear, and forgotten stories, preparing to rise not through force, but through the slow erosion of memory itself, because the thing beneath the valley does not need to destroy the world, it only needs the world to forget it was ever there, and in that forgetting, it becomes free.